On the prairie where the sky was a heavy iron lid, the boy Silas stepped off the porch, wearing no coat against the biting cold. His breath vanished into the air like a ghost. In his thin arms he held an old quilt, a fragile shelter for an even more fragile secret. He didn't look back at the warm house behind him, because where he was going, at the edge of the farm, a life lay balanced between this world and the next. And only he knew. The gray lid of the sky had sealed itself to the horizon, a heavy iron plate pressing down upon the plains. The cold was no longer the sharp bite of dawn, but it had seeped deep into the earth, a damp chill that promised a long winter. Silas, a boy of 15 who wore silence like a second skin, stepped off the porch. The floorboards groaned under his boots, the only sound to break the stillness. His breath appeared as a white cloud and vanished just as quickly. He wore no coat in his thin arms. He held an old quilt, a map of forgotten dresses and frayed shirts. Stitched together by fingers that now lay still beneath the earth, he told no one where he was going. His mother was by the stove. Her world shrunk to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. His father was in the forge, the ring of his hammer on steel the farm's own heartbeat. The barn stood at the edge of the property, where the fence listed like a tired old man and the weeds had long since claimed dominion. A murder of crows sat on the roof, black, vigilant silhouettes watching the empty air. The air inside carried the metallic tang of rust and the ghost of last fall's slaughter. Silas circled around the side, his boots making a quiet crunch on the hardened soil. At first, he heard nothing but the wind threading through the gaps in the wooden walls, like fingers feeling their way. Then the sound came again, faint and thin, not the sound of an animal, nor the sigh of the wind. It was something human, and it was nearly finished. He slowed, and then he saw her, a shape huddled against the fence line, folded into the earth as if trying to be forgotten. She wore a doeskin dress, once beautiful but now dark with damp and dirt. Her bare feet were unnaturally white in the dim light, the solace a cracked calligraphy of the land's cruelty. A thick dark braid was matted with dried blood and mud. For a moment, Silas thought he was too late. Her chest was still. Then her eyelids fluttered. A blink, slow and labored. He just stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. Her lips were split and scabbed. Her fingers clenched something small, a small leather pouch, its beads catching the flat light like chips of broken ice. She held it as if it were the only thing left in the world. He swallowed. "Ma single quotes you need help?" he asked, his voice cracking. There was no reply. Her gaze found him, unfocused, but it held. He glanced back toward the house. The windows glowed, small squares of warmth in the vast cold. His father would be sharpening his blade soon. His mother would be calling him for supper. No one would notice his absence for a few minutes. He knelt. Her body flinched at his shadow, not in pain, but in a deeper reflex, a recoiling from the world. I have a blanket," he said to the ground. She didn't answer, but her eyes stayed on him. He slowly unfolded the quilt. A gust of wind kicked up dust from the porch roof and sent it down the fence line. He let the quilt settle over her shoulders, a slow drift of faded color against the gray. Her body went rigid at its touch, then surrender, a letting go so slight he might have imagined it. He looked at her, really looked. She was not old. Her face was hollowed by starvation. There were dark rings on her wrists, stark against the pale skin, telling a story he didn't have. The words for someone had bound her. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. A crow called overhead. She blinked again, slower this time. Then her eyes closed. He didn't know if that meant peace or death. The wind grew colder, whispering secrets. He didn't understand. He backed away, stood, and returned to the house like a boy waking from a dream. Supper that night was silent. His father cleaned his rifle twice, muttering about strange tracks near the East Pass. His mother kept her gaze on the stove. Silas said nothing, but he kept glancing at the door, as if he had left a part of himself outside. That night he dreamt of ragged breaths, of blue and red beads scattered across Snowdot at first light. He returned. She was still there. Alive, just barely. The quilt steamed lightly, damp from her breath. She had hardly moved. He brought her water in a dented tin cup and a hunk of yesterday's bread he had hidden in his sleeve. She drank slowly, blinking hard with every swallow. He whispered, "You got a name?" She didn't answer right away, but this time her eyes didn't wander. They fixed on him. She pointed to her chest. "Nayani," she breathed, the word like autumn leaves skittering on stone. He tried to repeat it. "Nayanai." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, then she coughed, and a dark smear of blood stained the quilt. "Don't die," he muttered to himself. She looked toward the barn. He understood. He helped her up, and inside, in the smell of horses and silence, dust danced in the morning sunbeams. He made her a bed of straw in the back stall and covered her again. She curled into herself, and her eyes finally closed, not in pain, but in trust. He watched her for a while, then slipped out the side door. Ducking low, no one saw him return. That afternoon, his father found him mending the fence with wire. "See anything out of place today, son?" his father asked. His eyes narrowed toward the ridge. Silas just shook his head, the weight of the secret settling deeper in his bones. That night the wind shifted. The hounds in their pen did not bark, not once, and their silence was more unnerving than any growl. Silas couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, the rough wool blanket wrapped around his knees, and felt a hollowness in his bones, as if something had been taken from him and not yet replaced. He rose, his bare feet cold on the wood planks, and went to the window. The stars were chips of ice in a black ocean, but the prairie below was not peaceful. It was watching. Pressing his face to the cold glass, he stared into the darkness. Nothing at first. Then, on the far ridge, where the curve of the earth met, the stars, he saw them, not riders, not torches, just shapes. Still and tall, sentinels carved from the night itself, and they were waiting. He held his breath. His heart, which had been resting, now began a strong, steady beat against his ribs. He pulled on his boots. Outside, the frost had hardened, turning from lace to glass, and it shattered under his feet with a sharp crackle. He crept along the wall of the house, past the chicken coop, toward the barn. The door was ajar, a thin sliver, and a faint blade of light cut through the darkness. Inside, a single candle flickered on an overturned bucket. She was sitting upright, no longer the exhausted creature he had left. The quilt was still on her shoulders, but her braid had been untangled and combed smooth. Her eyes, when she turned to him, were clear now. They didn't look through him anymore. They looked into him. "This is no place for you, Silas," she said softly. Her voice was no longer a dry whisper. It had found some of its tone. "I was thinking the same about you," he replied. Something passed between them, quieter than the silence outside. She reached into her leather pouch and drew out a piece of dark wood, polished by touch. It was carved into the shape of a hawk in mid-flight, its wings spread in a moment of eternal power. She pressed it into his palm. It was surprisingly warm. "You looked at me," she said, "and you did not turn away." He looked down at the carved hawk. A faint breeze stirred behind them. The horses in the stalls snorted nervously. The candle flame danced. She turned her head sharply toward the east wall. "What is it?" he asked. She didn't answer, but outside, on the ridge, something had changed. Silas moved to a crack in the wall and peered out. Dark against the dark, he could see them more clearly now. They were mounted. He counted 4, then 7, then more. Then he could count in one breath, all still, all watching the barn. He stepped back, his throat dry. "Are they here for you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She did not move. Her eyes were fixed on him. "They are here for you." Confusion stunned him. "For me?" "They came to witness the reason," she said, "to see the blanket." He swallowed the fear that was rising in his throat. "I just ... It was the right thing to do." Her gaze held an ancient sorrow, and that is a thing they no longer believe exists. He didn't know what she meant, not yet, but he would. Outside, the line of riders grew longer, more shadows, a stillness so profound it pressed against the wooden planks. The whole prairie was holding its breath. And Silas, 15 years old, trembling in a barn with a woman who should have been dead, felt something ancient coil in his chest like a string being pulled taut by hands older than history. He stood beside her, and far across the frost, the ridge was filled with watchers, waiting for the dawn. The sun rose not as a warm glow, but as a bleeding wound on the horizon. Its weak light did not chase away the chill, but only made it clearer, exposing every figure on the ridge. They were no longer shadows. They were men, mounted on horseback, silent as the stones that had stood there since the beginning of time. Even the wind seemed to hold still before them. Inside the barn, the air was thick. Naomi stood beside Silas, the faded quilt on her shoulders like a strange banner. Her breathing was steady, but he could feel the tension in her, like a bowstring drawn to its limit. "They do not know what they are looking at," she said, her voice low and even. "Not yet." In the distance, a lone sound rang out, the church bell. From town, not a call to prayer but a frantic warning. A small puff of dust rose from the road as a rider galloped away to spread the news. The world beyond was waking up to the silent siege. On the porch, Jedediah, Silas's father, stood his ground, the rifle resting in the crook of his arm. His eyes were narrowed. "Never seen Apache ride so quiet," he muttered to himself. "Still water runs deep, and drowns a man just as quick." His wife, Maribel, stood behind him, her hands clenched together, her gaze darting constantly toward the barn. By mid-morning, a single figure detached from the line and began the descent. No haste, no challenge. The horse moved with a slow, deliberate gait. The rider was not a young warrior. He was a man whose face was a map of the seasons, every line a harsh winter or a dry summer. Naomi took a sharp breath when she saw him. The sound was not fear. It was recognition. The man stopped his horse just outside the fence and dismounted. Jedediah stepped forward, the rifle not aimed but ready. "You have business here?" The old chief did not look at the rifle. He looked past Jedediah toward the barn. "I come," he said, his voice as low and clear as stones striking one another, "because a story reached our fires. It spoke of one of our own, left for dead on this soil, and of a settler's boy who covered her with his family's warmth." Jedediah's face hardened. "My son keeps to his own kind." The chief's eyes did not blink. "Are you certain of that?" The silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. From the shadow of the barn, Silas felt the moment swell. Then he stepped out. He left the safety of the barn, his hands open, and walked into the empty space between his father and the chief. The wind tossed his hair. His boots made a crunching sound on the dry earth. "Silas, get back in the house." His father's voice hissed, but Silas did not waver. He turned to the chief. "She's alive. And I gave her the blanket." Jedediah's face flushed red. The old chief looked at him, a long, deep look. "Why?" Silas felt his voice tremble, but he spoke his truth. "Because ... Because she looked like something the earth had already decided to take back. And I didn't think it was the earth's turn yet." A long silence followed. The chief did not smile, but something in his eyes softened. "The earth does not own what a man of honor protects," he said. Then, to the astonishment of all, he slowly knelt. It was not an act of surrender, but an act of respect. And high on the ridge, a sound began, a low, rolling tremor. One by one, then by the dozen, the hundreds of warriors dismounted and knelt. The sound of boots, of bone, and of silent prayer rolled down the valley like a wordless thunder. Jedediah lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking. Then Naomi walked out of the barn. Her body was still thin, but she walked alone, the patched settler's quilt wrapped around her. She walked toward the kneeling chief, and he received her, helping her onto another horse. She did not cry. She only looked back at Silas once, a slow, solemn nod, an acknowledgement between equals. Then the chief turned his horse, and slowly the entire ridge began to move, hundreds of horses and riders turning silently and melting back into the horizon. By afternoon, the land was empty again. But something had changed forever. Silas went back into the barn. The silence was different now, not tense, but heavy with significance. Lying in the straw where she had lain was the gift of the hawk he had been given. And next to it another. A small buffalo carved from soapstone, solid and enduring. A promise of strength. An exchange had been completed. Snow began to fall 2 days later. Not a blizzard, but a gentle, steady descent that turned the prairie to silver under a pewter sky. Something had shifted in the house. Jedediah spoke less, but the tension had left his shoulders. Maribel stirred. The stew longer than necessary, her gaze distant. The silence was no longer the waiting for a conflict, but the settling of its aftermath. Silas did not speak of what he had witnessed. Not of the kneeling warriors, not of the stone buffalo inn. His pocket. It was his alone, and it smoldered inside him like a lantern kept warm under a blanket. But she was gone. That morning, he had found the quilt folded neatly in the barn, still faintly warm from her. She had not said goodbye. That was what hurt, not the leaving, but the absence of a single word. He returned to the barn 3 times. That day, once to check on the horses, once to touch the quilt, and once to check his own heart. Each time, something inside felt emptier. On the 3rd day, as he went for water in the dim light of dawn, he saw her. A dark heap collapsed in the new snow, a few feet from the barn door. He ran to her, panic catching in his throat. Her skin was burning with a fever that hadn't been there before. She was shaking uncontrollably. She opened her eyes, clouded with sickness. "I didn't mean to come back," she rasped. "But the snow... Ma." Silas screamed, his voice swallowed by the thick, falling snow. In minutes, the house came alive. Maribel ran out first, a shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders. Together, they lifted her. Jedediah appeared at the threshold, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He looked at his son, then at the unconscious woman, then at the coming storm. Without a word, he stepped back and held the door open. A silent truce was declared against the storm. They laid her on the small cot by the hearth, and for 3 days she drifted between this world and some other, muttering words in a relentless fever. Silas sat beside her, wiping her brow with cool cloths, and filling the silence with nonsense whispers. She was almost to the ridge, and she turned back, Maribel said quietly one evening. "Why?" Silas looked at the woman's ragged breathing. He thought he knew. "Maybe she wasn't running from us," he said. "Maybe she was running from this." He touched the quilt that covered her. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She opened her eyes to the soft yellow lamplight and found Silas asleep in the chair beside her, his knees drawn to his chest. She whispered his name. His eyes opened. "You're back." "I walked until I could not see your smoke," she said, her voice weak. "But you were still looking for it." She was quiet for a moment. "I am not used to quiet." "You'll get used to it," he said. She reached out her hand. He took it. Her fingers were weak, but they were warmer now. A week later, when she was able to sit up and sip broth on her own, a rider came. He came alone, on a black war horse, and his stillness was a threat. He had scars on his cheeks and an emptiness in his eyes. He dismounted and stood before the porch where Nyani was sitting, the quilt around her. Jedediah stood in the doorway, without a gun, but his presence was enough. "The council gave you to." "May," the man said, his voice flat. "The debt is paid." Nyani looked him square in the eye. "A woman is not a debt," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You saw a prize. He saw a person. That is the difference." The man flicked his gaze to Silas with contempt. "This is a boy's work." Silas stood beside Nyani's chair. "But it was a man's choice," he said calmly. The writer had no answer for that. He could fight men, but he could not fight this kind of truth. The silence stretched, and then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, swallowed by the gray of the winter day. That evening, after the snow had stopped, there was a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Henderson from the farm down the way. She didn't say much, just held out a jar of peach preserves, her eyes full of cautious wonder. She hadn't come to judge. She had come to see. And in the warm kitchen, under the lamplight, Silas knew that the fire they had lit was beginning to spread. Mrs. Henderson's visit was the first stone that sent ripples across a still pond. The next day, others came. A boy from the farm over the ridge with a basket of winter apples, which he set on the porch before running off without a word. An old man Silas had never seen before, on a mule, who simply sat on a stump for nearly an hour, watching the house, then nodded to himself and left. They were not coming to pry, they were coming to witness. A new story was being written on this old land, and they wanted to know how it would end. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the world outside was dark, Nyani sat watching the flames. "You gave me back my breath," she said without looking at him. Silas, adding a log to the fire, paused. "You learned how to use it again on your own." She was quiet for a long time. "It is a heavy thing," she whispered, "to be given a gift you don't think you deserve." He sat down in the chair opposite her. "Maybe you just have to carry it for a while," he said. "Get used to the weight." A week after that, they returned. Not as silent warriors on the ridge, but as slow-moving wagons coming down the valley, families. In tow, they did not come to threaten. They came to talk. Chief Stone Eagle led them. When he saw Silas standing near the barn, he stopped. His stern face did not smile, but the hardness in his eyes had melted. He looked at the boy, then at the land around them. "In a land of stone," the chief said, "you showed there was still soil for a good seed to grow." He looked at Silas more closely. "The boy who brought the blanket is not the man who stands here now." They held a council in the open space between the barn and the fence. Silas did not understand their words, but he understood the tone. He heard the hard, angular sounds of mistrust slowly give way to the softer vowels of consideration. He saw clenched hands now resting open. As the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of rose and violet, the council ended. That evening, Silas found Nyani standing outside the barn, looking toward the distant campfires of her people. "They have made a place for me," she said softly. "I can go home." The cold air hung between them. "Is it home?" Silas asked. She did not answer right away. Her gaze swept over the vast prairie where she had nearly died and where she had been reborn. "It was," she said. "I don't know what it is now." He came to stand beside her. "Then you don't have to choose their home or this. One. You just have to choose the next step. It's yours to take." She turned to him in the twilight. Something he had never seen before was in her eyes, not pain, not gratitude, but a clear, calm peace. She touched his arm lightly. "This roof still lets the stars in." Silas looked up at the gaps in the barn roof. "I reckon we can fix that." And then she laughed. For the first time, he heard her laugh, not a ghost of a smile, but a real, unburdened sound that came from deep in her chest. "We?" she asked, a playful light in her voice. That night, and in the nights that followed, a quiet change took root. Silas found his father, Jedediah, showing him how to set a new gatepost at the entrance to the farm, no longer just for defense, but for welcome. He saw his mother, Maribel, sitting by the fire, weaving a new rug, its threads of brilliant blue and red like the beads on the pouch Nyani had once clutched. And when the night was complete, there were 2 points of light in the great darkness of the plains. One was the warm glow from the windows of the house, and the other, steady and sure, came from the open door of the barn, where a woman sat by a small fire, not to run, but to begin.